Charleston in the year 1863 was a city trembling under the weight of cannon smoke and whispers. The war had already split its streets into two worlds, one of crumbling facades and starving families, and another of lavish parlors where the wealthy clung to rituals older than the Union itself. And it was here, in this half-lit city of decayed gentility and shadowed alleys, that the Rowan estate stood like a wound that refused to close. A towering mansion of pale brick and black shutters, perched on the edge of the Ashley River, where the tide itself seemed reluctant to touch its banks. The house had no music, no laughter, no warmth, only silence punctuated by the caw of crows that roosted along its roofline. The locals said those birds had nested there since the mansion was razed, as if waiting for something, guarding something, or perhaps feeding on something the family themselves could not name aloud. The Rowan name was already spoken with caution in Charleston's markets and churches. The family had money. Yes, but its origins were never clear. Some claimed it came from shipping. Others whispered it came from bodies. The quiet kind of trade carried out on moonless nights, when papers were never signed and records were never kept. The patriarch of the house, a man with cold eyes and a voice that could silence even the boldest merchant, appeared at church every Sunday. Yet his lips never seemed to move in prayer, and his wife, pale as driftwood and twice as still, never spoke at all. But it was their daughters who stirred the most unease, seen only rarely at the iron gates or pale faces framed by lace curtains. 3 young women who seemed not to belong to the age they lived in, always dressed in black, even in the heat of Charleston summers, their movements deliberate, their gazes too sharp, and the most unsettling detail of all, they never seemed to age by 186. 3. The whispers had hardened into fear. Soldiers billeted near the mansion spoke of faint singing drifting from the upper floors in languages they did not know. Fishermen on the Ashley claimed they saw figures walking across the marsh at night, cloaked and holding lanterns that never dimmed, and mothers in the city warned their children never to follow the sound of crows, lest they be taken into the Rowan house and never return. The city was already a graveyard of secrets, but the Rowans made Charleston itself feel haunted, and when the daughters vanished that year, it was as if the house had finally swallowed them whole. The first records of the Rowan family in Charleston do not begin with land deeds or shipping manifests, but with rumors written in the margins of church logs and whispered confessions, recorded by priests who dared not speak them from the pulpit. The family appeared suddenly in 1841, purchasing land on the edge of the Ashley, where the river bends sharply, and the soil is thick with marsh reeds. No prior records of their name exist in Charleston before that date. As though they had stepped into the city from some hidden corridor of history, the patriarch introduced himself simply as Master Rowan, never clarifying his lineage nor his place of origin, yet gold poured easily from his hand, enough to raise the mansion that loomed over the river. Its walls imported brick from Savannah, its shutters hammered iron, and its tower capped with a weather vane shaped like a crow with wings outstretched. The house seemed to rise not just from money, but from intention, as if every line and stone was placed to mimic some older, darker design. The city accepted them, for Charleston in those years was hungry for wealth and protection. Merchants and officers dined in the Rowan halls, drinking wine older than the guests themselves, yet always leaving uneasy, for the candlelight seemed never to brighten the corners of the house, and the daughters, even as children, walked among the guests with a stillness that made them seem like attendants rather than children, their black eyes reflecting the chandeliers like polished obsidian. There were whispers among servants that the Rowans brought with them more than furniture, that crates unloaded at night contained books bound in animal hide, glass jars filled with preserved birds, and instruments not for music but for rituals. One servant claimed she saw the matriarch tracing chalk symbols on the cellar floor, while her husband stood by holding a knife he never used. When pressed, she retracted her words, yet left Charleston on the first available ship. By 1850, the Rowans had grown into Charleston like a thorn, too wealthy to be challenged, too feared to be confronted. Their daughters, now approaching adolescence, were seen walking the gardens at dusk with cloaked figures who were never introduced to the city. and the crows that gathered on the roof seemed to multiply with every year. Townsfolk began to whisper that the birds themselves were messengers, that they carried more than feathers in their wings, and the church bells that rang across the city sounded weaker. Each Sunday the Rowans were present. It was then, even before the war, that Charleston began to wonder what the Rowans had truly come here to build. By 1861, Charleston was no longer merely a city of merchants and society balls. It was the furnace of a war that threatened to consume the nation. Cannon fire shook the harbor, Union ships strangled the coast, and families that had known only comfort now lived in hunger and dread. Yet at the Rowan estate the lamps still burned with imported oil, the tables still groaned with food brought in by unseen means, and the daughters still walked the balconies in black dresses untouched by dust or ash. The townsfolk whispered that the Rowans had made bargains, that while other households sold heirlooms to buy bread, the mansion on the Ashley remained flush with supplies. Some claimed they had seen wagons entering the gates at night, covered in canvas, the drivers never stopping to speak with soldiers, the cargo never revealed. When asked where such provisions came from, Master Rowan would only smile and say war brings ruin to some and opportunity to others. What unsettled the city most was not their wealth, but their distance. While neighbors sent sons to the front, the Rowans gave none. No soldier ever bore their name. No uniform ever left their house. Yet their presence seemed stitched into the war itself. For whenever Charleston suffered bombardment, the Rowan estate stood untouched. Shells fell short or veered off as if unwilling to strike the mansion, and soldiers camped nearby reported dreams of crows circling endlessly above their tents, dreams that left them waking in terror, with the taste of ash on their tongues. Inside Charleston's churches, whispers hardened into warnings. Preachers muttered that the family had bound themselves to something older than the war, that their daughters were the true inheritance, not their land nor their fortune. A diary found years later in the vestry of St. Michael's records a strange entry. The preacher writing that he had seen the rower and daughters in the churchyard one night, kneeling before the graves not to pray but to listen, their heads bent as if waiting for something buried to answer. It was said that as the war crept closer and the city shook with hunger, the daughters began to be seen less often, their windows shuttered, their figures absent from the garden. But when they did appear, it was at dusk, their movements synchronized, their faces pale as bone, and always the crows gathered in greater numbers as if summoned by their presence. By the summer of 1863, as Charleston braced itself against the Union siege, it was not the cannons that most haunted the city. It was the silence of the Rowan daughters, and the feeling that whatever they were waiting for, the war itself was only the veil. The siege of Charleston turned nights into endless dread. Hunger clawed at families, and soldiers prowled the streets like restless shadows. Yet while war devoured the city, another hunger took root along the Ashley. One whispered to belong not to the Union, nor the Confederacy, but to the Rowans themselves. For by the spring of 1863, people had begun to vanish. It started with a washerwoman, known to sing while she worked along the riverbank. One morning her song was gone, her laundry left unfinished, her bucket overturned in the reeds. No body was found. Then a soldier bivouacked near the Rowan estate was reported missing from his regiment, his musket discovered leaning against the iron gate as if set there deliberately. Others followed. A child chasing after a crow into the marsh. A fisherman who rowed too near the banks where the Rowan gardens touched the water. Each disappearance whispered, but never written. As if the city itself feared to make it real, servants in the Rowan house, few as they were, began to leave. One girl, a scullery maid barely 16, fled in the middle of the night. Days later, she was found half mad in the streets, muttering that the daughters walked without footsteps, that they gathered in the tower and spoke to something that answered back in voices that shook the walls. The girl was carried off to an infirmary and never seen again. Churchmen urged investigation, but soldiers had no time for superstition. They dismissed the vanishings as war's chaos, yet privately some admitted they avoided patrols near the estate, claiming they felt watched, that the trees themselves bent toward the mansion like eavesdroppers, that the crows would not leave them be. One letter, preserved by a Confederate lieutenant, speaks of a night patrol that glimpsed the daughters at the edge of the estate. each holding a lantern that burned too steadily against the wind. They walked single file toward the marsh and did not look back. Behind them followed the washerwoman, thought long missing, her eyes vacant, her hands clasped as though in prayer. When the patrol called out, she did not answer. She simply vanished with them into the reeds. The lieutenant swore. No footsteps marked the mud the next morning. By midsummer, Charleston no longer whispered of missing people as accidents. They spoke of them as offerings, as if the Rowans were feeding the war itself, and the question that spread among trembling lips was not if the daughters would vanish, but when. By late summer of 1863, the Rowan estate stood like a wound upon Charleston. Its shutters never opened, its windows glowing faintly though no lamps were seen lit. And while neighbours passed quickly on the opposite side of the road, a handful of servants remained, bound either by fear or poverty. And it was from their trembling lips that the city first heard what lay within those walls. "The kitchens," they whispered, no longer smelled of bread or stew, but of burnt herbs and iron. Symbols were carved into the stone of the cellar, circles that seemed to shift when candlelight struck them, some drawn in chalk, others etched so deep the stone wept dust when touched. One boy, tasked with sweeping the stairs, swore he heard voices from beneath the floor, not moans nor prayers, but a low, rhythmic chant, as though the earth itself were trying to speak through the stone. The tower, too, drew fear. It was said the daughters climbed it each night with lanterns, but no flame flickered through the slits of the windows. Instead, an otherworldly glow pulsed faintly against the clouds. One night a servant, bold with wine, climbed the back stair to see. He returned pale, unable to speak for days. When he finally did, his words were broken. He claimed the daughters knelt in a ring, their faces covered in ash, and that something leaned between them, vast, bent and faceless, yet its shadow stretched across the floor like a man's. Stranger still, the mirrors of the mansion were covered in black cloth, all but one in the upper hall. That lone mirror, a tall gilt piece brought from England, was said to breathe faintly when one passed, as if the glass itself drew air. Those who looked too long swore their reflection blinked out of rhythm. One girl insisted her reflection turned its head when she did not. That night she fled and never returned. Letters from a nurse attending one of the fleeing. Servants described the final straw, for the girl's hands were raw, rubbed to blood from polishing the grand dining table, not because it was dirty, but because stains returned each night, dark patches that smelled of brine and copper. No matter how she scrubbed, the wood seemed to drink it back in, and always at the head of the table sat an empty chair, turned slightly toward the hearth as if awaiting a guest. By August the house had become less a dwelling than a shrine, one erected not by choice, but by some unseen command. And though the war raged on outside its gates, those who dared to speak of the Rowans swore the true siege was happening inside, unseen and unanswered. By autumn of 1863, Charleston was weary of cannon fire and ration lines. Yet it was the Rowans' mansion that sickened the people most. For though the city burned in places, though men fell daily in the streets, the whispers about that house spread like plague, and soon the fear of it outweighed the fear of war itself. Neighbours began reporting that the voices once confined to the cellar now bled beyond the gates. Late at night, passers-by swore they heard chanting in a language without syllables, a drawn-out sound like breath dragged across stone. Some claimed the voices were not many, but one, stretched and folded upon itself, and on damp nights when fog rolled from the harbour, the glow from the tower flickered against the mist like lightning that never ceased. Children dared each other to touch the iron fence, yet many refused, for the rails grew warm after sundown, as if heat pulsed through them from the earth. More than one boy came home with blistered palms, though no fire was near. Mothers forbade the lanes around the estate. Yet even in their own homes, people swore they heard footsteps above their ceilings, though no attic lay there. It was a squad of Confederate soldiers who finally broke the city's silence. 3 were quartered in a house 2 doors down from the Rowans. One night they burst into the street, half-dressed, claiming something had entered their room. a black form with a face like smoke. They swore it pressed its weight upon their chests and spoke the names of their dead brothers. By morning, the captain of their company ordered an inspection of the estate, both to quiet the soldiers and to silence the city's hysteria. On October the 14th, a column of 12 armed men marched up the drive. The iron gates creaked open without touch. Though no servant greeted them, neighbors watched from shuttered windows as the men disappeared inside. Hours passed. The Cercasisi. An evening fell. At last only 4 stumbled out. Uniforms torn, faces scratched, eyes wild. They spoke little, but one, his voice gone to a whisper, said the others were taken into the walls, and when pressed, he collapsed in the street. From that day on, the Rowan estate was not merely feared, it was despised, no longer a mystery, but an affront to the living. And though the city was occupied by war, the house became its own battlefield, standing defiantly against both prayer and steel. On November 2nd, 1863, Charleston's patience ended. The war had hollowed the city, food was scarce, disease clung to the air, yet it was the Rowan estate that drew more hatred than any Yankee cannon, and so a quiet assembly gathered after sundown. Not soldiers this time, but townsfolk, men with calloused hands, widows who had buried too many children, even a preacher who no longer trusted prayer, their voices low, their torches wrapped in rags soaked with oil. They agreed on one thing only: the house had to burn. The plan was simple. They would breach the gates, scatter kindling against the wooden frame of the servant quarters, and let fire do what men could not. Yet as they approached, the very air shifted. Witnesses swore the wind died all at once, leaving the night thick and unmoving. The torches flickered but did not go out, though their flames bent inward toward the house as though pulled. At the iron gates, the first man thrust his torch forward, and before he touched it, the flame elongated like a tongue, striking the rail. A hiss filled the street, not the hiss of water on fire, but of breath, slow and deliberate, as if the house itself inhaled. Every torch wavered, shrinking smaller until the crowd stood in near darkness. Still, desperation breeds courage, and 3 men clambered over the fence, landing hard on the gravel. Their boots crunched loud in the silence. They ran toward the quarters with oil flasks raised. But before they reached the wall, the windows of the mansion burst open, not with fire but with a deep crimson glow, a pulsing wet light that made their shadows ripple like water. One of the men screamed that the ground beneath him was sinking, yet when onlookers squinted they saw no pit, only that his legs thrashed and then vanished to the knee as though swallowed. The preacher shouted for retreat, but the crowd froze. Some swore the glow from mile. The windows formed shapes, faces of those already buried in the city, wives, brothers, children, beckoning with pale hands, calling their names in familiar tones. It was too much, and the mob scattered, dropping torches that snuffed themselves before striking earth. By morning, the house stood untouched, the gates locked once more, but on the lawn lay a single boot. Its leather soaked through, though the night had been dry. No one claimed it, for no one claimed to have crossed the fence. By December 1863, Charleston streets murmured the same conclusion. If fire could not claim the Rowan estate, then iron and powder would, the city's commanders, weary of whispers that the mansion itself was a greater enemy than any Union cannon, authorized a drastic order. The house was to be reduced to rubble. On the morning of December 14th, 2 field pieces were wheeled through the frost-hardened streets, their iron mouths aimed directly at the estate. Soldiers gathered grimly, relieved at last to end what torches and mobs could not. The mansion's upper windows reflected the grey sky like blind eyes, and yet none who stood before them could shake the sense that the house was aware of its own sentencing. The order was barked, the first cannon primed, a fuse lit, yet the powder fizzled, coughing out smoke without spark. Men muttered. Equipment was checked. Nothing appeared wrong. Another fuse was set, the charge carefully packed. This time the flame leapt. The roar of ignition filled the street, but the ball rolled no further than the cannon's lip, dropping heavy onto the stones as if spat out by the gun itself. Anger spread. Officers cursed their men, thinking it cowardice or sabotage, until the second cannon was fired, this one prepared under watchful eyes. Its fuse burned clean. Its chamber shook with thunder. But when the smoke cleared, the gun sat intact, its load still nestled inside, untouched, as though time had reversed within its barrel. The soldiers stepped back, some crossing themselves, others swearing outright. For when they turned their eyes again to the mansion, every shutter had closed in unison, slow but deliberate, like the blink of something alive. A ripple of sound followed, not quite wind, not quite voice, but the steady rhythm of breath, as though the house exhaled in triumph. The commander, red-faced and trembling, ordered retreat, though he refused to admit it was fear. Yet the truth spread quickly, for within hours the city spoke of it. Cannons that bent their will, powder that betrayed its spark, and a house that no man could kill. That night, a soldier who had touched the second cannon was found dead in his barracks. His hands blackened, though no fire had touched him. His mouth frozen wide and carved into his tongue in blistered letters were two words: not yet. When the Union tightened its noose around Charleston in the summer of 1864, the Rowan estate lay directly in the line of fire. Its slate roof glimmering faintly beneath the cannon smoke, Union gunners perched on Morris Island and the harbor's edge marked the mansion as an easy target, its size impossible to miss, its silhouette etched against the ruined skyline. The first shells screamed overhead, tearing through warehouses, granaries, and churches. Charleston burned with iron fire. And yet, though dozens of shots landed across the district, not a single shell fell upon the Rowan estate. Witnesses swore they saw the arcs bend mid-flight, as though drawn away at the last instant. One soldier claimed he watched a mortar veer so sharply it dropped into the Cooper River like a stone skipped from an unseen hand. At first, the Union assumed faulty aim, but when their cannons ripped apart smaller houses on either side of the estate while leaving the Rowan mansion untouched, whispers ran even through federal camps. Officers barked orders, more fire, more pressure. But the gunners' faces paled, for they knew the truth. Their aim was steady, their charges sound. It was not their error. It was something else. Meanwhile, inside Charleston, those who had doubted now turned their fear inward. What did it mean if even enemy fire refused to touch the place? Mothers began dragging their children past the estate with hands over their mouths. Fathers refused to speak its name aloud. Merchants moved their stalls blocks away, claiming the very shadow of its walls soured their bread and rotted their wares. One night, during the heaviest bombardment, a Union shell was seen falling directly toward the estate's roof, flames sparking off its iron skin. But before it struck, the shell burst in the air, silent and strange, scattering no fire, no shrapnel, only a mist of sulfur that drifted in. To the street, choking two soldiers who collapsed where they stood, their throats burned black as though swallowed by smoke. By dawn, the mansion stood immaculate, not a scratch, not a stone displaced, even as its neighbors lay in heaps of ash. Charleston's citizens began whispering that the Union siege itself feared the Rowan house, and some dared wonder aloud what power resided inside. Not for Charleston, not for the Confederacy, but for itself alone. And when the next week brought silence from the Union guns, though no orders of ceasefire had been given, both armies looked upon the mansion the same way, not as home, not as fortress, but as something older, standing only because it had decided to. The fires of siege had turned Charleston into a furnace, and still the Rowan estate stood untouched, black slate shining in the moonlight like a crown that no fire could unseat. It was then that Reverend Alcott, a gaunt minister from St. Michael's, stepped forward with a trembling conviction. He declared before his dwindling congregation that the mansion was no home but a vessel, that no war could touch it because no earthly hand had raised its walls. He carried no musket, only a battered Bible and a brass crucifix that caught the torchlight. His sermons had grown fevered, warning the city that what they endured was not God's punishment, nor the enemy's, but the wrath of a presence seated inside that house. He claimed the mansion bent the arc of cannon fire, not to shield Charleston, but to preserve itself. Like a beast protecting its lair, one night he marched alone toward the gates, a crowd trailing behind him, some desperate for proof, others too afraid to let him go alone. The streets were silent except for the groan of the wounded and the hiss of smoke that still drifted from the docks. The people kept their distance as Alcott pressed forward, clutching his Bible until his knuckles whitened. He raised the crucifix and began to chant. Not the calm cadence of Sunday worship, but a jagged, furious rhythm. He hurled Latin like stones against the iron gates, shouting for whatever dwelt within to reveal itself, to be cast out. The air thickened. The sound of cannon fire far off dimmed into silence, and those watching swore the torches faltered as though smothered by unseen hands. Then the gates trembled, not from any earthly wind but from within. The iron rattled, hinges groaned, and the cross in Alcott's hand grew so hot he dropped it with a cry. Some said the Bible itself flared, a single page curling into flame before the rest fell into ash. The crowd gasped, so, me dropping to their knees, others fleeing into the ruined streets. Alcott stumbled back, his lips blackened, not burned, but as if ink had poured from within his lungs. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came forth, his eyes wide with horror. He turned, staggered into the watching crowd, and fell lifeless at their feet. By morning, word spread faster than the fire ever had. No priest, no minister, no church could touch the mansion, and the people stopped calling it a house at all. Instead, they whispered a new name with trembling lips. The Inviolate. The place that could not be struck, not by man, not by war, not by God. The siege had dragged on into a season of hunger and despair, and whispers of the Inviolate spread through the ranks like a fever. Soldiers cursed it under their breath. Some prayed at its gates before moving past, yet none dared cross the threshold. It had become a kind of phantom barricade, a shadow fortress immune to shell and fire. But war does not tolerate the unknown. Commanders weary of rumors, desperate to stamp out anything that bred unrest, issued an order that a detachment of men would storm the Rowan mansion at dawn. They called it reconnaissance. But those who received the order knew it was no act of strategy. It was punishment. Punishment for their fear. On the chosen morning, 10 soldiers were assembled, their uniforms ragged, eyes sunken from hunger. They marched with bayonets fixed. Though each step seemed heavier than the last, the townsfolk watched from shattered windows, some clutching rosaries, others silently mouthing prayers, as if they were sending men not into a house, but into the grave itself. The gates groaned when forced open. No resistance from iron or lock, as though the mansion itself permitted them entry. The men advanced across the gravel drive, their boots crunching in unison. The facade loomed above them, windows dark as sockets in a skull. The great doors stood waiting, tall enough to swallow them whole. The captain ordered one man forward. He pressed a trembling hand to the wood, and with a reluctant push, the door swung inward, not creaking, not protesting, but gliding soundlessly as though it had been waiting. A stench rolled out, not rot, not smoke, but something sweet, cloying, like lilies left too long in stagnant water. The soldiers hesitated, shifting, muttering, but the captain barked them forward. They stepped across the threshold, bayonets gleaming, eyes darting, and as the last boot crossed the line of the door, the Sion gave a sound that froze even the bravest. It was not a groan of wood or stone, but a low sigh, like breath drawn deep into unseen lungs. The doors shut without a hand to move them. The echo rolled across the street like thunder. The crowd watching outside broke into panic. Some cried out for God, others fled into the alleys. Only the captain's voice, muffled by the walls, was heard shouting orders, growing fainter with each word, until silence swallowed everything. The 10 men did not return. Not that day, not the next. Their names recorded in the rolls as missing, presumed dead. Though no body was ever seen, no sound was ever heard again from within the mansion, and the townsfolk swore the house seemed taller, darker, as though it had absorbed what it had devoured. The disappearance of the 10 soldiers did not kill the rumor of the Rowan mansion. It fed it, like kindling thrown to a growing fire. The townspeople whispered that the house was not simply a ruin, but a vessel, an open mouth that took in whatever dared to cross its threshold, and once swallowed, never gave back. Families of the missing soldiers, wives, mothers, sisters, were left with no graves to weep at, no bodies to bury. So they turned to the gates. They brought small things at first: rosaries strung with cracked beads, a child's wooden toy, a folded scrap of scripture. They laid them at the wrought iron and fled quickly, refusing to linger in its shadow. Then came bolder offerings: food and bread, jugs of water, meat from rations none could spare. Some swore the food was gone when they returned at dawn, not taken by beggars or strays, but consumed, absorbed, the plates left clean as though unseen mouths had feasted. Others whispered of coins vanishing, trinkets dissolving, the gate itself humming faintly when touched. Priests were begged to intervene. But few would stand before the house. One young curate, trembling with fear yet determined, sprinkled holy water across the threshold, chanting rites in Latin. His voice cracked midway through the prayer, and he collapsed into silence. Witnesses swore the water had not splashed or soaked the ground, but vanished. Like droplets striking a hot stone, a widow, refusing to accept her husband's absence, tied his wedding ring to the gate with a length of string, promising she would return each day until he was given back. The next morning the ring was gone. The string remained intact. Frayed where the knot had been, she screamed that the mansion had taken him fully, not just his body but his bond. Soon the offerings became ritual, the gates a kind of altar, children too frightened to play near, women clutching their veil. Airs and whispering the credo under their breath as they passed, men crossing themselves quickly. Some cursed the families for feeding the hunger of the house. Others argued it was the only way to keep it quiet, to keep it sleeping. Yet not all offerings were made from faith. Some were made from desperation. A drunkard staggered to the gate one night and spat, slamming a flask against the bars, shouting for the mansion to take him if it had the courage. The next morning, only the flask remained, his absence noted, his debts forgiven, but his name struck in silence from the parish rolls, and thus the Rowan mansion became not merely feared, but treated like a shrine not of God, but of something older, darker, something that fed on loss, something that took not what was offered but what it chose. The Union had pushed closer, their boots marking Charleston soil, and with them came an officer named Colonel Warren, a man of pragmatism who sneered at ghost stories. When he first heard whispers of the Rowan mansion, he dismissed them as backwoods superstition, the kind of hysteria that festers in wartime. Yet when his own men refused to bivouac near its shadow, when even seasoned veterans muttered prayers under their breath at its mention, he declared it a matter of discipline. He ordered the house destroyed, nothing elaborate, nothing symbolic, just fire and powder. He assembled 20 men who trembled but obeyed. They carried torches, kegs of black powder, bundles of pitch-soaked cloth, and marched under cover of dusk. By the time they reached the house, the air had grown still, so still that even the insects ceased their song. Their boots echoed too loudly, as though the earth itself were hollow beneath them. Warren barked orders. Men stacked powder at the foundations, others pressed torches to the wood of the porch. But the fire, once hungry and bright, flickered weak. It curled in on itself, like a candle guttering. The cloth hissed smoke but would not ignite. The pitch dripped like tar, black and useless. Some swore the flames bent backward, away from the house, retreating as if repelled. The colonel, furious, demanded more fire, more powder. He struck matches himself, throwing them at the shingles, at the windows, at the splintering shutters. Yet each match died before landing, snuffed by air too thick to breathe. He cursed, his voice cracking. But the men said his words sounded swallowed, as though the night itself devoured them before they could carry. When he commanded a powder fuse lit, the flame crawled slow and reluctant, then extinguished halfway. Smoke rising, but no roar, no thunder, no collapse. The house stood silent, indifferent, its charr. Red spots, black but cold, its walls untouched by ruin. One soldier, trembling beyond reason, broke formation. He flung his torch against the parlour window. The glass shattered, yet no fire spread. The torch simply vanished, as though plucked from sight. His scream followed a heartbeat later, and when the men rushed, There was no soldier, no body, no trace, but the echo of his boots still clattering inside the empty house. The rest refused to continue. They dropped their weapons, their powder, their torches, backing away as Warren threatened them with court-martial. But his threats carried no weight against that silence. The house breathed against them, not with sound, but with presence. And when they finally fled, stumbling through the dark back to camp, they swore the mansion loomed brighter than fire itself, though no flame had caught, its windows glowing faint as though lit from within by something older than war. The failure of fire gnawed at Colonel Warren like a wound. He was no man to be mocked, and whispers spread quickly through camp that the house had refused to burn. Men spoke of curses, of a structure claimed by something more ancient than timber and stone. Warren heard these whispers and felt his authority splinter, discipline frayed not from bullets but from shadows. So he resolved to end the matter in the simplest, most brutal way. He would occupy the house himself, alone, for one night, a test of courage, a statement that no myth, no phantom, no southern sorcery, as he spat the words, could stand before the will of a Union officer. He told his men at dusk that he would return at dawn, and when he returned, they would raise the place with renewed force. His pride demanded nothing less. He took with him only a lantern, a revolver, and a silver flask. His boots struck the porch heavy and hard. His knuckles rapped the door as though to challenge it. Then he stepped across the threshold, the lantern's glow trembling along the faded wallpaper. His men, from a distance, watched the yellow light flicker in the windows, a lone pulse against the black shell of the house. Hours passed, some men gambling, others praying, none daring to sleep, and always that faint lantern glow moved inside the mansion, room to room, methodical, as though Warren was conducting an inspection. His shadow dragged long behind the glass, sometimes tall, sometimes crooked, sometimes wrong. Near midnight, the glow stopped in the upper windows, a bedroom perhaps. Then it flared, bright as though the lantern had been raised high. The men leaned forward, squinting, waiting, but the flare dimmed, and the light began to pulse, slow, rhythmic, unnatural, like a signal not made by human hand. A scream followed, faint but sharp, like a nail driven through wood. The sound carried no words, just raw tearing. Panic. The lantern tumbled, visible in the glass as it rolled, then vanished into dark. Silence fell harder than cannon fire. The men wanted to rush, but fear shackled their legs. They waited, whispering prayers until the first light of dawn. When at last courage, or desperation, drove them forward, they crossed the field. Their rifles clutched white-knuckled. They climbed the porch steps and found the door still ajar. Inside, dust lay thick, undisturbed. No overturned furniture, no lantern, no footprints across the boards. Only Warren's revolver rested on the parlor table, 6 chambers untouched, its metal cold as though it had been there for years, his silver flask beside it, empty, though none had seen him drink. Of the colonel himself, there was no trace, no body, no blood, nothing but the faint scent of smoke, as though something had tried once more to ignite, but failed. And when one soldier whispered that perhaps the house had taken him the way it had taken the missing torchbearer, none argued. They simply left the revolver and flask behind, unwilling to carry what now belonged to the house. From that day forward, no Union soldier spoke Colonel Warren's name near Charleston. They called him the one who stayed. And the Rowan mansion was no longer just a ruin. It was a wound in the earth, an open mouth, waiting for whoever dared step inside. Charleston society, for all its silks and manners, had always thrived on whispers, on carefully guarded truths that no newspaper dared print, and the Rowans had supplied fodder enough to last generations. Yet what no one spoke of aloud was the shift in atmosphere that clung to the family after the disappearance of the daughters. It was not simply the absence of their laughter in the garden or their pale faces at the Sunday service. It was as if the very air around their estate had thickened into something hostile, a weight pressing down on anyone who lingered too long by the rusting gates. Even carriages passing on the distant road seemed to hasten their pace, as if the horses themselves sensed the trespass of a boundary. It was in those months that journals, locked away in attics and later found by descendants, begin to hint at phenomena not quite natural. One battered ledger kept by a visiting physician describes being called to the house on a storm-ridden evening, summoned by the Rowan matriarch who had refused to explain the purpose until he was already inside. He claims he was shown rooms that seemed impossibly colder than the rest of the house, hallways where his candle dimmed until the wick sputtered and died, yet no draught could be found. No cause identified. The matriarch asked only that he keep silent and leave. Then there are the letters, written by a neighbour's governess, who swore that from the servants' windows she saw lights moving within the Rowan estate, at hours when no sane household kept awake, single file, as if lanterns were being carried down into the earth itself. She described them vanishing not toward the stables or gardens, but into a place that seemed to sink into the ground, as though the family had opened passages below their property where no outsider could follow. The whispers began to evolve into conviction, the belief that the Rowan Tao, it were not missing in any ordinary sense, but hidden, concealed for some ritual, preserved in a state between life and death, and though no one could say who had begun that rumour. Once it spread, it rooted itself into Charleston's consciousness. The city's congregations muttered that the Rowans were dabbling in rites that should never have left Europe, ancient and cruel. But what chilled even the most sceptical was not the rumours. It was the silence of the family itself, the refusal to issue any denial, the locked shutters, the vanished servants, and the oppressive quiet that seemed to deepen each year until the Rowans were less a family and more a ghost that haunted the city, their name only spoken in lowered tones, as if saying it too loudly might invite something watching in the dark. By the winter of 1865, Charleston had grown restless. The war was winding down, and the air itself carried the sourness of ruin. Yet beneath the hunger, the shortages, the endless funerals, the name Rowan was still whispered with more dread than the Confederacy's collapse. It was not only that their daughters had vanished, or that their house loomed like a carcass over Meeting Street. It was the fact that nothing, no official notice, no prayer, no inquiry, ever broke the suffocating stillness that surrounded their estate. And in that silence the people began to imagine horrors worse than any soldier's bayonet. It was the dock workers first, half drunk and furious at a winter of empty bellies, who muttered in the taverns that someone should set fire to the place, that the Rowans were hoarding food in their cellars, while the rest of the city starved. One night a mob gathered, torches flaring against the rain, and they marched down Meeting Street with the intention of cleansing the old house from Charleston's memory. Yet when they reached the gates their courage faltered, for the iron bars seemed slick with something black that was not rain. And though no wind blew, the torches hissed and went out one by one until only the darkness remained. The mob dispersed in silence, and no man spoke of what he had seen. But resistance took other forms. Pastors thundered from pulpits that the Rowans were a curse upon the city. Merchants swore they would not trade with the family even if begged, and neighbours crossed the street rather than walk before their gates. Still the house stood unyielding, and if anything its presence grew heavier with every month. Its windows darkened, its chimneys cold, as though it had abandoned any pretense of being a home, and instead become a monument to something unfathomable. Then came the retaliation, subtle at first, a merchant's child wasting away with no clear illness, a pastor's wife found wandering the churchyard, barefoot at midnight, muttering words no one understood, chickens born eyeless, wells that stank of iron. The afflictions always fell upon those who had spoken loudest against the Rowans, as though the family's silence was not mere withdrawal, but listening, watching, and punishing. By the spring of 1866, the town was no longer simply afraid. It was convinced that to act against the Rowans was to invite ruin upon one's house, convinced that their daughters were not lost, but preserved in some half-seen chamber where they were neither alive nor dead, convinced that the house itself had become a mouth and the city merely prey hovering at its threshold. Charleston did not forget the Rowans. It learned to live beneath them, as a man learns to sleep knowing there is a serpent coiled in the rafters above his bed. In 1871, 6 years after the mob's torches guttered out in the rain, a gaunt figure appeared at Charleston's market square, barefoot, trembling, his hair white, though he could not have been more than 30. The crowd stared, for they recognized the sunken face, though they could not at first believe it. Ezra, one of the Rowan servants, a boy once known for carrying baskets along Meeting Street, who had been presumed long dead, now stood before them, whispering as if every word cost him breath. They gathered close, merchants and beggars alike, their hunger not for bread this time, but for truth. And Ezra gave it, though not in the way they expected. He did not accuse the Rowans of murder or witchcraft or the secret burying of children. Instead, he spoke of rituals beneath the house, rituals older than Charleston itself, older than the war, older than the city's founding. He said the Rowans were only keepers, vessels, a family chosen to guard something beneath the floorboards, and that every disappearance was not theft, but an offering. He told them of a chamber deep under the estate, a place the servants were forbidden to enter, where the air shook with the hum of unseen wings, where voices seeped from the walls like water through stone, and where daughters of the family were taken on nights when the tide pulled unnaturally far from the shore. He claimed he saw one once. Eliza Rowan, pale and unblinking, led into the earth by her father as though she were a bride, and though she walked downward, her eyes never left Ezra's until she vanished into the dark. The crowd recoiled, some spat, some laughed nervously, but others, older, wiser, or more cursed, listened with an attention that froze their blood. Ezra said he escaped not by courage, but because the house itself expelled him, cast him out like spoiled flesh, for his body could no longer bear what it had seen. He begged them not to touch the Rowans, not to break the gates, for what they kept was not their own. And if released, it would not simply take Charleston. It would consume the coastline, the plantations, the rivers, all of it swallowed until the sea itself closed black over the land. He collapsed before finishing, and though physicians tried to rouse him, Ezra never opened his eyes again. His body withered as if drained of marrow. He was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the square. Yet his words remained, repeated in whispers, like a fever that would not break. And for many it was not the details, but the way he had spoken. Hollow, certain, as if merely relaying instructions left in his skull by something other than himself, that lingered most. From that day forward, Charleston stopped imagining the Rowans as neighbors, or even enemies. They were not people, but thresholds, doors with faces, and though the estate rotted visibly with every year, no one dared approach, for to do so was to trespass not against a family but against a force. The soil itself seemed too terrified to contain. By the winter of 1873, Charleston's leaders could no longer ignore the Rowan estate. Too many eyes turned toward its decaying silhouette on the edge of town, too many rumors, too many whispers of Ezra's final words, and with the war's scars still raw, the city craved order, not another phantom enemy rising from its soil. So the council decreed what the mob had failed to finish years before, that the house would be seized, demolished, and the ground sanctified with stone and prayer. On the morning chosen, a procession of men gathered, not the drunken rabble of before, but an organized force, officials, hired laborers, and even a chaplain clutching a thick black Bible. Their tools gleamed in the sun, axes, hammers, saws, and yet as they crossed the iron gates, a silence fell so sudden it rang louder than any bell. The birds fled, the cicadas choked off mid-cry, even the air seemed to congeal, heavy and unmoving, and though the men pressed on, sweat broke over them as if they had already been digging graves. They began with the shutters, tearing them loose, but the wood crumbled not like timber, but like ash, pressed too long between fingers. One man struck the wall with a hammer and recoiled with a scream. The iron head had snapped clean off as though it had met not wood but bone. Another pried at the door hinges, only to find the metal soft, bending in his hands like lead. The chaplain muttered prayers, his voice trembling, yet every word was swallowed by the air as though he spoke into cloth. Then the ground itself began to resist. The soil shifted under their boots, filling holes they dug, coughing up stones not seen in Charleston's earth before. Black, porous, smelling faintly of salt and blood, as if the sea had vomited them from its gut. Ropes frayed, carts overturned, and when the men tried to light a fire against the walls, the flame hissed and went dark. Suffocated, no, by rain or wind, but by a strange dampness that seemed to breathe from the boards. The officials grew restless, angry at superstition, ordering the men back to work, but already some refused, crossing themselves, fleeing down the road pale as corpses, while others worked with glassy eyes as though hypnotized, striking walls yet never making progress, each swing landing softer, quieter, until even their blows seemed rehearsed, meaningless gestures against a house that was not decaying but feeding on their exhaustion. By dusk, the attempt was abandoned, the men staggering out as though drunk, unable to recall what tasks they had completed, tools left behind half buried in soil that no longer looked like soil, but more like wet clay, black and pulsing. The council ordered another attempt weeks later, but those hired never returned, and when questioned their families swore the men had vanished into the estate itself, their names carved into no record, their faces slowly forgotten. From then on, Charleston's leaders changed their tactics, no longer speaking openly of demolition, instead treating the Rowan estate the way sailors treated a whirlpool, marking its position on the map, steering around it, never daring to test its pull. The house stood not only intact but triumphant, its refusal to die a declaration that rattled even the boldest voices in the city. The strangest part of the Rowan disappearance was not the silence left behind in their halls, but the voices that locals began to hear afterward, drifting from the edge of the swamp when the moon struck silver across the reeds. They were not simple echoes of the past, but sharp whispers, clipped syllables spoken as though an argument were taking place just out of reach. Some swore they heard girls crying. Others insisted it was laughter, broken and mocking, the kind that cut through a man's chest like a blade. Yet every time someone gathered the courage to step closer, the swamp went still. Water flat as glass. No breath of wind, no sound of life. Men of reason tried to explain it away, saying that the human mind invents what it fears, that frogs, owls, and trickling streams could merge into phantom tones. But those who lingered long enough near the Rowan land swore the sounds were not random. They were patterned. They were deliberate. They followed a rhythm, almost like a litany, a chant whose meaning hovered just beyond understanding, as if the sisters themselves were conducting some ritual still unfinished, still yearning for completion, even though no one had seen them for decades. One old trapper who spent his nights in the low country claimed he once saw figures on the water itself, pale and glowing, like girls in thin gowns walking hand in hand across the marsh. The reflection in the water showed no feet, no shadows, only ripples spreading outward until the whole swamp seemed to shiver. He never set foot near the Rowan land again, selling his cabin at half its worth to a stranger just to leave without delay. It was said that if you stood at the property fence and called their names, you would not hear your own voice echo. Instead, you would hear another, softer, closer than it should be, a whisper behind your ear, answering you in the same cadence as though the sea. Istas still lingered, trapped between silence and return, longing to be remembered, or perhaps longing to be obeyed. No one could say for certain, but those who dared to test it left trembling, muttering prayers as though they had come within an inch of something far older and darker than the Rowan name itself. By the 1870s, the Rowan land had become a wound on Charleston, a place everyone knew yet no one admitted to fearing. And yet fear hung there heavier than smoke. Men would rather walk miles out of their way than pass the broken fence where the swamp met the road. Women clutched rosaries if their eyes accidentally fell on the decayed gates. Children were told not even to speak the name Rowan after dark, for to do so was to invite the echo, and the echo was what terrified them most. For now the whispers were no longer confined to the swamp. They bled outward into Charleston itself, first into the homes nearest the old property, where night watchmen heard soft knocks at their shutters, only to find nothing there, then into the market stalls, where merchants swore they felt someone breathing down their neck while counting coins, until finally it spread into the churches, where more than one priest confessed in hushed tones that during prayer they heard a second voice repeating the words in unison, but lower, broken, twisted, almost as though mocking the holy rite. The town was unsettled in a way that no storm, no fire, no war had ever made it. This was not a ruin that could be rebuilt, not an enemy that could be shot. It was an infection of sound and memory, a haunting that carried the flavor of unfinished promises, the kind of thing you could not scrub from wood or wash from cloth. Some elders whispered that the Rowans had not simply vanished, but had traded flesh for voice, choosing to endure not as bodies, but as sound carried on the air, bound to Charleston like a curse stitched into its very breath. One evening, a sailor home from the sea swore he saw them walking at the edge of town, 4 pale figures gliding past the lantern glow, hair drifting as if under water, their faces blurred yet unmistakably female. And though he was drunk when he said it, no one laughed. Not even there. Men who usually mocked such talk, for too many others had felt it by then. The sense that Charleston was being watched, that every whispered prayer, every confession, every secret conversation was heard by something that did not forgive silence and did not forget betrayal. By 1872, the whispers had become more than background dread. They began to bend men in ways that could not be explained by fever or madness. It started with the night patrols who guarded the riverfront. One by one they reported hearing a voice behind them, not loud, not frightening at first, but familiar, like the voice of a mother, a brother, a lost love. And when they turned, there was no one there. Yet the voice continued, urging them to walk further into the dark, urging them to leave their post, urging them to do what they would never confess aloud. Some returned hours later soaked in mud, unable to recall where they had gone. Others never returned at all. Merchants in Charleston began losing track of their ledgers, counting sums they swore they had tallied correctly the night before, only to wake with their books rewritten, ink warped, signatures distorted, names replaced with unfamiliar ones, names that matched the Rowan family records from the old parish logs, names no one had spoken for decades, as if the town itself was being rewritten in their hand. Wives whispered of their husbands talking in their sleep, chanting long strings of words that carried no meaning, yet left the air heavy as incense. Children were found wandering the streets at night, their small hands grasping invisible companions, insisting they had been called outside to play. And when asked who had called them, they would only say the family wants me, and then weep, without understanding why. The most terrifying shift came in the churches, for even the priests could no longer deny the invasion. During sermons, parishioners swore they heard double voices echoing through the nave. The preacher's words mirrored and warped, as if another mouth spoke alongside his, repeating them in tones too broken to be human. The altar candles flickered not from draught, but from breath, and one Sunday a woman screamed. Her own confession was spoken back to her before she had uttered a word, the priest dropping his rosary in terror. The whispers had ceased being passive hauntings. They were now architects, rewriting lives, distorting memory, bending Charleston's will toward something it could not yet name. And those who still remembered the Rowan house whispered the one truth no one dared speak aloud, that the family had not died at all. They had only changed the manner of their existence, and they were gathering strength. By autumn, the whispers no longer scattered themselves like stray gusts. They began to harmonize, weaving into something deliberate, a rhythm too measured to be chance. Men in taverns would pause mid-drink as their ears caught the same 3 words repeated under the breath of strangers they had never spoken to before. Women at market froze as vendors unconsciously hummed the same low cadence. And in homes across Charleston, children began scrawling identical crooked symbols on their slates, each mark resembling the sigil carved into the beams of the Rowan cellar decades before. Though no child could explain where they had seen it, the town began to move as if possessed by a single hand. Shopkeepers changed their hours without consulting one another. Bells tolled at wrong times, but all the clocks agreed. and fishermen swore their nets filled only when they sang the same fractured hymn that had begun infecting the churches, a hymn no choir had rehearsed. Yet every throat seemed to know. When questioned, each denied ever learning it. Yet the words spilled from them naturally as though planted at birth. A farmer's wife, pale with fear, confessed to the priest that she had woken in the middle of the night to find her husband standing at the edge of their bed, whispering not to her, but through her, his lips moving silently, yet her own mouth forming the words aloud, a chant she did not understand. But when she begged him to stop, he looked at her, not with cruelty, but with confusion, swearing he had been asleep the entire time, swearing he had never risen from the bed at all. What terrified Charleston most was not the violence of these intrusions, but their order, the precision of an unseen intelligence guiding every small act, bending the town not toward chaos but toward structure, as if laying groundwork for something vast and final, and though some clung to faith, others paired what no pulpit dared admit, that the Rowan family had not only survived in spirit, but had learned how to command the living, how to orchestrate flesh as easily as memory, how to prepare the city for their return. The old innkeeper at the wharf, whose eyes had clouded with age, muttered to sailors that the Rowans had become more than ghosts. They had become architects of fate itself, bending Charleston into a stage for their design. And when asked what design that was, the old man only shook his head and whispered, "They are building a mouth, and the town itself will be the voice." By winter, Charleston no longer breathed with its own lungs. It pulsed with another rhythm. The streets themselves seemed narrower, as if the houses leaned inward to listen, the air thicker, as if the very sky pressed closer to earth. Men who once argued about politics now spoke in unison about the gathering. Women who once baked bread now left it untouched to rot, while they etched symbols into their doorframes. And children, once noisy, once unruly, now sat silent in the squares, their eyes glassy, waiting for something only they could see. The church bells rang on their own, without rope or hand, tolling in perfect sequence with the tides, and when the priest tried to silence them, he found the ropes had woven into knots too intricate to be undone, knots that resembled veins or nerves, pulsing faintly as though alive. He left them untouched after that, whispering that Charleston was no longer his to shepherd. Then came the night no one speaks of, but all. Remember, the night the harbour froze without frost, the night the air bled red along the horizon, the night the voices stopped being whispers and became one voice, deep, layered, speaking not above them, but through them. Every man, woman and child in Charleston opened their mouths at once and gave it form. Words not of English nor Latin, but something older, syllables that rattled the marrow and tore the air like thunder. And with each phrase, the ground trembled, the windows bent inward, and the town itself reshaped as though it were not wood and stone, but flesh waiting to be commanded. And then it was over, not with fire or collapse, but with silence, a silence so total that sailors arriving days later found the docks empty, the streets abandoned, tables still set for supper, but no breath left to fog the glass, no prints in the snow, though candles still burned. Charleston had not fallen to disease or flame. It had been emptied, its people taken not upward, not downward, but inward, into something built beneath their feet, something that fed on unity, on surrender, on the very order the Rowans had ceded. To this day the city remains, rebuilt, bustling, unaware of its own hollow beneath. Yet those who dig too deep claim the soil is warm, the earth hums faintly, and at night in the oldest quarter the shutters rattle in rhythm, as though the town is still breathing, not with lungs, but with the endless mouth the Rowans left behind, a mouth waiting for its next command, waiting for its next voice, waiting for you.